welcome to the Mariah Gene Fit YouTube channel. I'm Coach Mariah. Make sure you like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos as much as possible so we can reach a broader audience. We appreciate your support and enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube, podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast if you're tuning in there. It's Coach Mariah here yet again, no surprise. I will have more people being interviewed on my podcast soon, but I've got a lot of topics to get through before we get there. So today we are talking about how to effectively gain more muscle, or how to gain more muscle effectively, whichever way you want to put it. So probably going to be a hot topic for both men and women. We find that there are more women now than ever that are wanting to gain muscle. And I find as well that men tend to not take me seriously with my tips on gaining muscle because I'm a female, until they realize I'm as muscular as it gets naturally as a female. And it might be actually a smart idea to listen to the person who probably has a harder time gaining muscle but still has been able to do it anyway. So people trying to diet and gain muscle at the same time probably give me the most amount of frustration out of any type of goal to gain muscle. It's but I don't want to gain any body fat in that period of time. I want to gain lean muscle. I don't want to gain any body fat, and I want to eat in a calorie deficit while I go through that growth stage. And the simple answer is it's not fucking possible. It's just not possible unless there is use of illicit, illegal, and very dangerous substances. Yes, there are some instances where it's possible, but even then, it would still be optimal with an excess of calories available. So basically eating in a calorie surplus, not in a calorie deficit. So if you think that you are hell-bent on dieting, eating in a calorie deficit, and gaining muscle, I can tell you you're going to be there for a very, very long time. And you may actually lose muscle if you don't even do that properly. So probably the biggest tip I would give to anybody wanting to gain a significant amount of muscle, I'm not talking maybe a kilo of muscle across a few years, but I'm talking if you want to get jacked shoulders and jacked arms, you want to grow, even glutes, even my female clients are like, no, I don't want to grow muscle. I'm like, what do you think a butt is made of? Your glutes are made of muscle. Things like getting definition in your arms, getting definition in your legs, etc. This all comes down to a reduction in body fat, yes, but you need to have muscle there to begin with. You need to actually have something to show. If you don't have something to show, you're going to struggle with that conditioning. You're going to struggle with seeing the lines. I do see people try to cut down and they haven't even gone through a growth phase, or at least they haven't been eating enough food and even doing weights training for long enough. And they think that maybe a year of training, all of a sudden they're going to pop up with these amazing muscles and abs and shoulders, and it's just going to happen overnight. And it doesn't happen that way. It really doesn't happen that way. Even people who are, as I mentioned, using illicit substances, we're talking about PEDs, we're talking about things that no one talks about, funnily enough, in the fitness industry, not nearly enough. But even those who are using those substances, the ones that are super jacked, it's taken them years to get to where they are. They didn't just wake up overnight. They didn't just get there in a year. It takes time. The human body is not some sort of robotic, structured, mechanical being, in that we can't just force our bodies to grow muscle very quickly. That's just not how it works. It's not like building a house. It's not like building a car. It's not like you can just put the parts on as you please. It's actually quite an interesting process in that you need to purposefully try to grow muscle. It's something that, yes, as human beings, we're capable of doing, but if you are trying to, for your own aesthetic reasons, trying to grow particular muscle groups and even maybe evenly across your body, you need to have a plan for that just as much as you would have a plan for losing body fat. So obviously I'm going to clear up that it's really important to know what your goals are. And it's really important to know that wanting to grow a large amount of muscle and lose a large amount of body fat at the same time they are two conflicting goals, meaning that you are choosing two things that do not go well hand in hand together, okay? So this is why you see often in the fitness industry this reference to bulk and cut. I'm going through my bulk and I'm going through my cut and I'm going through my bulk and I'm going through my cut, or I'm going through my growth phase and I'm going through my diet phase or my deficit phase, okay? Back in the day, it was very much called bulk and cut. And everybody would bulk in winter and cut as they were leading into summer. Now, that's actually probably not too dissimilar to the process required. However, if we look at it from a perspective of, bulking for the same amount of time as cutting, it's actually not relative in what you achieve in that amount of time, okay? So I'll use the comparison because this is fantastic, right? We talk about when we go into a calorie deficit, we're dieting, we're trying to lose body fat. If we're being really consistent, the maximum amount of time that you really probably could diet for without some sort of serious side effects, and you will get side effects after a certain point, obviously, it's very normal for dieting, but let's say 5 to 6 months, right? We know a competition prep is usually between 20 and 30 weeks, and that's a cut down phase, which has lots of diet breaks in between. We're not just straight dieting the entire way through. We certainly do increase calories to reverse any metabolic adaptation, that type of stuff, and really get the athlete through to the finish line, okay? But that is probably the maximum amount of time you'd want to spend dieting, right? Any longer than 5 to 6 months, and you're probably going to go batshit crazy. Your body's not going to react very well to it. And specifically with women, we have a risk of getting something called REDS, R-E-D-S. So it's a syndrome whereby basically our body just starts to reject the idea of dieting, and you will see things like a loss of period, etc. You will see things like a loss of energy availability for workouts and training. You will see things like hair loss, all sorts of crazy stuff that starts to happen when this sets in, and there is a higher risk of complications with your heart and all sorts of nasty stuff that you don't want to go down the path of. So this is why if you are listening to this and you've been dieting straight for a few years, you really need to tune into this part, okay? So obviously with a deficit, we only want to run it around, honestly, this is obviously professional and personal opinion, but 5 to 6 months. Some have to go longer and they have to have periods of time in between, maybe because they've got a lot of body fat to lose, where they're having diet breaks quite regularly, etc. But for the most part, 5 to 6 months, that's just like where things just start to go be a bit pear-shaped. And honestly, I would say a minimum of, 2 to 3 months for an impactful deficit, okay, to see some decent results. That's why you see 8 to 12 week challenges and things, because that's where people will see change, and also where right before you start to get a lot of that metabolic adaptation kick in, okay? So, however, with growing muscle, on the other hand, it's almost like the polar opposite in that the 6 month period of growing muscle, eating in a surplus, feeling uncomfortable in your own skin, etc., is the minimum recommended period of time to purposely try and grow muscle. Yes, you heard me right. You cannot go on a 12-week growth phase or bulk and actually really achieve anything sort of significant. Yes, you will. You will achieve some muscle growth. It's not like you're not achieving anything for those 12 weeks. But you're going to see the most payoff for the longer period of time that you spend in a surplus. Why? Well, obviously, if the body has more food to work with, it's less likely to use our protein as an energy source. So when we consume protein, this helps repair our muscles that we've teared during our training. And the protein is actually something that can, yes, be accessed as an energy source, but only generally if the body doesn't have enough carbohydrates to use or lipids to use instead, so it will access proteins. Now, this is where we can start to see, obviously, the idea where people, if they're overtraining and under-eating and lots of high heart rate work, where they can actually incur not just the idea of stagnant muscle growth, so no muscle growth, and just maintaining their muscle, but also if they go too far into that direction, especially the high heart rate training without adequate carbohydrates, especially prior to training. So if you're trying to train fasted, it's a big no-no. You'll see people actually muscle waste. So this is where you see, and this is why I wouldn't recommend, this is probably my next point, where you see some people who have these contradictory goals where they're like, I want to run a marathon, but I also want to gain 3 to 4 kilos of lean muscle mass. In that instance, this person would have to be consuming a considerable amount of calories to keep up with the marathon style training, and obviously a ton of carbohydrates as well. But also, on the other hand, with the resistance training, you'd be looking at this idea that if you were gaining muscle from those resistance training sessions, there's a risk of you losing that muscle in your marathon marathon training, because you are in those higher heart rate zones, and we just don't know when your body is running out of glycogen. Generally, it's around the 90-minute window where we start to see the stores that are fully depleted. And so this is again why we don't want these long, bouts of cardio fitness, etc., put on top of our training if we're trying to grow muscle. So that brings me to my next point. People ask me if cardio is a thing when you're trying to grow muscle. I mean, yes and no. I'm going to say it's not a major focus, right? You don't kind of build your training with cardio and then weights on top. My biggest tip with that would be literally do your weights first. So if you're having carbs prior to training, because obviously we're trying to grow muscle, we want fuel for our training. If you're having your carbs prior to training and then you're going to the gym, the first thing you should be choosing is doing your weight. You want to make sure that it's kind of like using the fuel for the thing that you want to work hardest at, right? And then obviously after that, yes, maybe you could commence a walk if you want to increase your steps. And that would just be to buffer any sort of excess fat gain that you might see from eating in a calorie surplus. But whereby I do see a lot of people kind of go into a calorie surplus and they're like, cool, now I can do like no steps daily. I'll just do like 2,000 steps daily and I'll just try and train off all the food I'm eating. Doesn't always work that way. Some of our sessions will burn less calories than others, and that is where we are going to be left with a significant amount of body fat gain if we don't pick up the pace a little bit with our steps here and there to try and, as I said, buffer some of that excess body fat gain that we might experience in a calorie surplus. So that's where I suppose where you could say purposeful cardio, so going for a walk on the treadmill, which is actually technically called low intensity steady state cardio. In that case, you could implement that because we know that in the low heart rate zones for cardio being just a walk, we're not actually going to be needing any sort of carbohydrates. So if we've burnt through that from the weights training, we can actually just go for a walk afterwards. The body will access lipids, so fat stores, and we're good to go. Now, in that case, obviously, we've also got to look at this idea that, again, if we are, we can't always guarantee that the body's going to access just lipids. If we are in a calorie deficit, we're trying to purposely lose body fat, again, the protein that we're consuming may not be prioritized to go to those muscle groups to grow the muscle. So it all points back to this whole idea that protein intake is obviously key when it comes to growing muscle. Like that was going to be another one of my points, is that yes, your protein intake is going to be key. Yes, it's going to be a particular level for each individual person depending on a few factors. And yes, you're going to want to prioritize consuming protein throughout the day to a certain extent. It's not going to kind of benefit you by spreading it out if you're in a calorie surplus, but it's also not going to benefit you by eating it all at once. From a muscle growth perspective. But in saying that, it is just good for your digestional comfort, so you're not too full, to spread your protein out. And obviously protein timing, people go crazy about this, like I've got to have my protein shake after my training, or I'm going to lose my, I'm going to go catabolic. Yes and no as well. There's been a lot of studies recently in sports nutrition with SNA, the provider that I go through for registration and my education, and they've actually found that they can agree upon this idea that we used to think it was kind of that 1 to 3 window that was like, you've got to get in there, otherwise the protein won't be used. But if you're not really doing any sort of crazy, cardio after your training, etc., then really you've got to look at the idea that, okay, if you're in a calorie deficit, if you're in a calorie surplus, whatever it is, it's generally the window anywhere from 1 to 6 hours after training. 1 to 3 is optimal, but then they do see some benefits up to 6 hours of dosing protein. So really, I honestly just like to have some sort of protein. After training, I tend to find I'm pretty hungry, and most people will be eventually after a couple of hours. So it is nice to just pop some protein back in again, but it's around 25 grams is the recommended serving for a full serving of protein. So you don't have to have a damn protein shake. It's like people go, do I need to eat my protein? Have my protein shake after my workout? No, you don't need to have a protein shake at all. You could literally have lean beef. You could literally have chicken breast, egg whites. You could have some high protein yogurt. Yes, you could have a protein shake. You could have a protein bar. You could have protein powder inside yogurt, whatever it looks like for you to get that 25 gram serve. Try to get it within the first 3 hours, obviously, but up to 6. And if you look at it, you could probably go up to 3 hours afterwards, dose, and then another 3 hours, have another 25 grams kind of thing. So really, there's a lot of hype around nutrient timing with protein in particular, but we just got to look at it like protein is a part of a building block of a meal, and it's the foundation of a meal generally, and sometimes of a snack as well. And honestly, for digestive comfort, spreading it out during the day is smart for being in a calorie deficit when you're dieting, but also when you're in a calorie surplus, so that you don't feel overly full, like you're shoving a heap of food in all at once. Obviously, because protein is a highly satiating macronutrient, so it fills you up. It's the one that fills you up the most out of all macros. So that's why I always recommend spreading your doses out. Don't get too fastidious with it. It's not like we're saying you have to be exactly, 25 grams every meal or 30 to 40 grams every single meal. It's not always going to call for that in everyday life. You might have to get 50 grams in one meal and 20 in another, but it's that 25 gram serving post-training, optimally between 1 to 3 hours, even up to 6. So now we've kind of discussed a couple of the points, talking about the fact we know that you can't grow muscle optimally in a calorie deficit. So MPS just doesn't really occur at its best in calorie deficits. You can gain muscle, and I have seen this happen with myself and even some of my athletes. I'm just going to say this from experience with my own clients, but obviously it's not going to be necessarily as strongly supported in studies, but whereby you do see some muscle gain during a maintenance phase. So where the person is actually consuming just as many calories as they are expending for the day, so the energy their body is using, they're eating just as many calories, and you can actually see some muscle gain there. Even in a calorie deficit, I have seen clients gain some muscle mass. I've even gained muscle mass in a calorie deficit myself. However, it's much slower, if possible at all, and you will find that it will fluctuate up and down. So it's really one of those things where I can't vouch for it that it's going to be at its best. If you are looking at growing shoulder caps, like, you can see I've got some decent shoulders on me. If you're looking at growing some decent glutes and you really want, if you've got a long way to go with that, you need to do a specific phase in a calorie surplus, minimum 6 months. Honestly, you can do 3 months, but you're going to see minimal results because of the time it takes. Really, honestly, a build can take up to 3 to 4 years. I know it sounds like a massive amount, but if you look at, for example, bodybuilding Olympians, etc., they take decent amounts, especially the females will take long periods of time off between their shows. They should be to grow significantly, but also outside of that, it's things like making sure they're taking care of their hormones, etc., and making sure that their cycle returns and the like, and they can't guarantee that if they're constantly bulk cut. So in that though, you can do what we practice quite often with athletes and to try and get them through the 3 to 4 year growth period, or even a 2-year growth period, or even a 6 to 12 month growth period, and that is engage in something called mini cuts. Now, mini cuts are generally anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks. They're really not aggressive deficits, so they're not massive deficits. They are going to be something that basically, brings you down into a deficit enough to see fat loss at a certain extent, but not necessarily facilitate the full goal of fat loss that you might have of what you're wanting to achieve towards the actual ultimate end goal. Maybe it might be competing, maybe it might be a photo shoot, etc. So for these mini cuts, they're kind of designed to give you a little bit of an idea of what you've been working for underneath the fluff, underneath the body fat, and underneath the things where, you can't quite see what is happening with your delts or what's happening with your glutes and legs, and you just want to peel back the layers a little bit and see whether or not you've been, getting closer towards those physique goals you've got. Maybe you just go, what, summer's coming up and I feel like I've been in a calorie surplus for a while. I would like to do a mini cut. Take yourself through that mini cut, obviously, or with a coach. I wouldn't necessarily suggest just taking yourself through a mini cut. It's not that easy, but you can go through a mini cut with your coach, and then at least you've got that option to break up the surplus. And then obviously you would need to go back into maintenance or surplus after that mini cut. So mini cuts are literally designed to be a mini amount of time that you spend in a calorie deficit. So obviously I've been talking a lot about nutrition, and I will be honest, it is a major component of growth. I get this common misconception that people just dirty bulk. They're like, oh, I'll just eat a ton of food. Oh yeah, I'm eating enough. I hear this all the time, especially from male clients. Holy, I'm eating plenty. Like I eat so much food. Okay, cool. You don't even know what so much is. Like, you could pick up a muesli bar and it's 200 calories. You could literally pick up a cup of spinach and it's 10 calories. It looks exactly the same for how much volume it takes up. But really, there's such a massive difference in calories. And obviously, on the other hand, you might be eating, a ton of calories, but maybe not quality calories. If you're eating cheeseburgers, if you're eating a ton of deep fried food every single day, you're downing soft drinks, etc., etc., etc. You've got to look at this idea that, okay, what is happening? Like, what is actually happening in here for me to have my optimal nutrition for what I'm trying to achieve? Am I actually doing that? If you're just consuming takeaway foods and a ton of saturated fats, you've got to look at this idea that it's probably not going to get you to your goal as efficiently as what you wanted to. Even though you think you're just consuming a ton of food, it's not about just consuming a ton of food. You wouldn't require a particular macro breakdown. It's going to be a range. Honestly, it will be a range. It's not, you don't have to be too fastidious about it. It'll be a range of optimal fats, optimal carbs, and optimal protein for your goals. Okay. And you will be able to get away with up or down of that. But if you're eating a ton of saturated fats, there's actually no benefit to consuming those for performance or muscle growth. We know that. So really, in the big scheme of things, if you're just eating a shit ton of food, you may not be hitting your protein intake, and you obviously may not be actually eating enough carbohydrates or even enough quality carbohydrates to assist with things like balanced blood glucose, etc. And along the lines of fruit and vegetables, I always suggest that when someone's going through a growth phase, yes, you're going to eat more food. So yes, you're going to have a little bit more room for things like cereals, some chocolate, some lollies. Like, we're going to need a little bit more sugar to fill up the carbohydrates for people eating in a calorie surplus. We know that, especially if you're training at an athletic level, and that's considered kind of 5 to 6 times a week, intensive sessions, an hour to 90 minutes of training. So we will have to bump up carbohydrates and sugar a little bit in that instance when you're going to a calorie surplus. But obviously, I always suggest to keep your fruit and veggies in your diet. There's nothing stopping you from consuming your 2 fruits and 3 to 5 veg daily. That's going to be fantastic for your immune health. It's going to stop you from getting sick so you don't get held back in your growth stages. And obviously, it will help out with the absorption of other vitamins and minerals, because when we consume our fruit and veggies and get the vitamins, essential nutrients that we need, those vitamins and minerals we need, it actually aids in the process of things like strengthening your joints and your ligaments, and it will aid with your energy levels, your overall health and well-being, and also your moods, which will then obviously be able to assist with your energy for your training sessions. You will show up as a better version of yourself. You're not going to be feeling shitty and lethargic and tired because you're iron deficient, because maybe you're not getting enough iron in from even plant-based sources, etc. So this is a big issue, is that when people bulk, they're like, I will just eat all the food and I won't worry about getting essential nutrients in and getting the healthy stuff in. Or on their reverse, I see a lot of people only eat clean. So they'll only eat just like a ton of rice, a ton of veggies, and and just lean proteins. And they're like, oh, no, I can't have chocolate or lollies and I'm not allowed to have any of that stuff. And it's like, or who wrote that rule book? In the instances of athletic level training, they've found with sports nutrition that we actually require some simple sugars, which used to be referenced as simple sugars. They're now called something different. But basically some of those, not so complex carbohydrates that can be quickly absorbed and we can actually utilize for our training and performance. So that is going to be things like jelly babies and things that you actually enjoy, which are going to be nice and close to your training to assist with your performance. So currently, if you're trying to eat a whole bowl of rice and veggies right before training, you're probably going to have a shit time with your digestion if you're in a surplus. But you're also going to find that, hold on, I may not be getting that quick release of energy for my training, and I may need to change my carbohydrate type in that instance. So that's why eating in a surplus is it's fun, because you still get to include foods you enjoy, etc., in smaller amounts, obviously, to get to your carbohydrate intake, but you still need to keep your fruit and veggies in there for health, energy levels, moods, and obviously preventing any sort of sickness. So obviously, amongst all of this as well, it's really important to see a professional if you can. Get a coach, get someone who can talk to you about this stuff, who can give recommendations. Don't just think to yourself, I can do this on my own. This isn't me plugging myself as a coach. There are plenty of coaches out there. There are coaches who are more expensive than me. There are coaches who are cheaper than me, whatever it looks like, but someone who is the right fit for you, whether it's someone who does a plan for you or whether it's someone who does your macros for you, but gives you some sort of guidance, in the direction that you would like to go in for your growth stage and is honest with you just the way that I'm being. A coach says to you, It's possible to grow significant amounts of muscle mass in a calorie deficit. Please walk in the opposite direction. It's just not possible. You will grow small amounts, but just not enough to hit those massive goals you might have to grow large amounts of muscle. So I'm going to move on to the next point, which is obviously we need to incur our training as hypertrophy. So basically, hypertrophy is a terminology that's thrown around quite a lot, but basically it is it's a performance process. It's performance of repetitious weights training. Sorry, I was getting my words right. It's a performance process of repetitious weights training, okay, whereby we push the muscle until near failure under tension, so time under tension, right? Now this could mean in the use of cables, dumbbells, barbells, you name it, like all sorts of weights equipment. It doesn't have to be specific pieces of equipment. Obviously a nice variety is good, but basically to then obviously incur subsequent muscle tears and then obviously subsequent repair to those muscles. So basically you can imagine it's kind of like we've got these micro tears happening on a very biochemical level, like a very small level, whereby when we give the muscles enough resistance and enough tension, and stress, what we would call stress to the muscle. Basically that allows our muscle to tear. I know it sounds kind of gross, but tiny little tears, and then the protein actually goes in and acts as a repair, and we actually we end up building muscle from that. So that's the building blocks of muscle. Okay. Now there's a whole lot of other stuff that happens in that process as well. Lots of complex biochemical processes, but I won't go into it. All I will say is that hypertrophy is literally the purposeful process of trying to grow muscle. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to train like a powerlifter. I see people often assuming that, powerlifting style training, strength training is almost like this crossover into hypertrophy training. I mean, yes, to a certain extent, powerlifters are going to grow a significant amount of muscle during their training, absolutely. But you can actually just engage in hypertrophy training without the requirement of training like a powerlifter. So you can train out of those, for example, the 1 rep max range, the 3 rep max range, and even the 4 and 5, right? So anywhere upwards from say 6 to 8, you'd be looking at increasing your strength. And that's where you're kind of coming out of that powerlifting, power range, and you're going into more strength. And then obviously as you progress, or even up from 4 onwards, and then upwards from there, we're looking at hypertrophy, so between 8, 12 and above, even up to 30 reps, hypertrophy can occur. But basically the major focus is it really doesn't matter where the rep range is, whether it's like 8 to 12 or up to 30, as long as those final reps are very difficult to perform. And that's where we see the RPE and the RIR scale come in. They're basically scales that coaches use to give clients an idea of how hard they should be training towards their goals. If you are training for muscle growth, you're going to have to be training pretty hard, okay? You can't just mosey on into the gym and do a couple of bicep curls and expect your muscles to grow. You will have to push your reps to a higher position where you're able to perform perform the exercise effectively. None of these half rep bicep curls, getting a full extension and obviously contraction of the muscle. So I do see a lot with people who want to grow muscle. They're like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a hero and I'm going to lift really heavy weights. The problem with that is that you're basically lifting with your ego, and in that you probably won't grow the muscle that you want to because you're so focused on lifting as heavy as possible, not really realizing you're probably putting a bit of pressure on your tendons and joints, and you may not even be performing the exercise optimally. I'll use the bicep curl as an example. You do see a lot of blokes in the gym with the dumbbells and they're kind of doing these half reps, like throwing them up. Really, they're not isolating the bicep as best as possible in that direction of movement. If you can drop the weights right back and stop lifting like a dick, if you slow down the bicep curls to the point where you can actually feel the muscle extending and contracting, that's where you will actually see optimal hypertrophy occurring as well. So there's less ego lifting when it comes to muscle growth, and certainly more mindfulness of feeling muscles engaged in the exercises. If you're not feeling the muscle engaged, you may be performing it slightly incorrectly. Some people are. They're just, maybe the posture's not in the right position. Maybe they're maybe not gripping it properly. Maybe they've got the wrong type of grip. Maybe they're kind of overextending their wrists or whatever it might be. Or your weight may be too heavy, right, for what you're trying to achieve for the rep range. So it's where you've got to find that sweet spot. And honestly, it really just comes down to progressive overload. So it kind of comes down to having an idea of knowing that you're pushing hard enough right? So that you aren't just moseying on through and cruising and staying on the same weights type of thing, but also not glorifying the idea of doing PBs every single week with regards to numbers and weights, right? Because people get stuck on this. They're like, oh, my upper body doesn't get strong. Like I'm stuck on, 10 to 12 kilo dumbbell shoulder press and I've been stuck here for a couple of months. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of different ways to progress in lifts, especially if you're stuck on particular numbers. Things like slowing down your reps, so making sure that you're really slowing down the negative, the eccentric part of the rep, not the concentric. And if you're wondering what that is in an exercise, it's usually the part where it's really hard not to let go. Okay, so it's not usually with push exercises, it's the down, and with pull exercises, it's the up. So there's obviously lots of different exercises where the eccentric can be in different positions, but it's just basically the hardest part of the exercise where obviously holding on to it is very difficult. So that's where you'll find the eccentric. If you're worried about eccentric reps, ask a coach. They can usually help you with particular exercises, how to slow that down. But yeah, slowing down your movements can actually help out with tearing muscle, actually, weirdly, because the muscle is under tension. Your muscles don't know how heavy you're lifting. It's not like you pick up a barbell or a dumbbell and you're like, your muscle's like, yeah, it's a heavy 7 kilos. Yeah, love that 7. No, your muscle just literally picks up the dumbbell and does what it can do for that particular period of time under tension and the amount of times that you're performing that movement, right? So, and it knows when it's fatigued because obviously it starts to near fail and you can't get that dumbbell back up again. So we know that that's not necessarily reliant on a particular rep range. It's not like you have to hit exactly 8 or exactly 10. And it's not even reliant on you doing a particular weight either. So this is the interesting thing is there are two, I remember being explained to me, the 2 greatest Olympians of all time, and they were 2 completely different styles of training. One was training really heavy and, massive lifts, right? And the other one was doing really high reps and lower to moderate weights. Funnily enough, they both ended up, building a crazy amount of muscle, and one beat the other one quite a lot, and then the other one beat the other one. You probably know who I'm talking about. But when you think about it, as Jay Cutler and Ronnie Coleman, right? This is the comparison. But when you think about it, you look at Jay Cutler, he doesn't have any sort of crazy injuries. He's in those kind of higher rep ranges. And I mean higher as in he's not trying to be a powerlifter. And then you have got Ronnie Coleman, who is obviously, he's got some injuries there. So really, well, a serious back injury. So when you look at that, you've got to think about, okay, maybe leaving my ego at the door is a good idea when it comes to growing muscle. It's not necessarily a concept of go as heavy as possible every single week. But it can look like slow progression up through weights. If you get stuck, hold your eccentrics, and certainly be very patient with the process because you do not go up ahead in leaps and bounds with muscle growth or strength very quickly at all. It's a very slow, very, very slow process, and it slows down as you get to probably the optimal amount of muscle mass that you can fit on your frame. So when you try to get to freakish positions with more muscle mass, it gets harder to gain more muscle mass. So indication for those who already have quite a bit, it doesn't get easier. It just gets harder. It just gets harder. But it is obviously, once you've gained muscle, pretty easy to maintain if you don't neglect your protein intake and if you obviously aren't dropping your weights back too significantly for too long. So the next point, I would suggest obviously following a structured program with an even split. So obviously even upper and lower, depending male or female, goals can obviously differ slightly, with men probably preferencing like the upper body more than the lower. But please don't be that guy who just trains legs once a week, a male, or if you've got physique goals that don't need you to grow legs, sure. But you've got to think that your legs are the base of your entire body, and it actually can help you out with things like bent over rows, etc., for your stability. Also, legs are a fantastic fat burner. The more muscle mass we have, the more fat that we burn. The bigger your legs are, the more fat you're going to burn, and they are a massive muscle group. So you imagine that they're obviously going to be able to push more weight than our upper body usually. They should be able to. So they can also burn more calories in our workouts. So legs, do not underestimate how great legs are to create almost like an athletic metabolism. But yeah, if you're a male and if you're avoiding training legs, please stop doing that. It's just wrong. Like it's been left in the 2000s. We don't need to not train legs. It's actually really wonderful to have a nice balanced structured physique. And if you keep avoiding legs, you're pretty much going to end up having to do it anyway eventually. So don't avoid leg training. Female, same thing with females, same thing with upper body. Don't avoid training upper body. If you think about it, holding onto that barbell, if you're trying to do hip thrusts or, for example, actually more so a deadlift and the like, if you're trying to hold on to a piece of equipment for your lower body exercises, you're gonna have a really hard time with it if you don't focus on strengthening your upper body and growing muscle in your upper body. And also, you don't look very balanced if you don't have a bit of upper body strength and muscle definition. Being all lower body is not all it's cracked up to be. Trust me, eventually you will probably find yourself trying to grow muscle in your upper body, especially if you compete, or if, for example, you're a CrossFitter, you're gonna need a lot of upper body strength. So this is where we need to see an even split. Now, you can have an even split, or you can look at the idea of maybe you've got muscle groups that are bigger than others, maybe bigger upper or bigger lower body or bigger quads or whatever it might be. And you might not need to go as hard with that particular muscle group because you have that it's nice and developed, so you can just maintain that. In this case, obviously with programming, talk to your coach, but if you need to work on your shoulders, you might need to incorporate more work with your shoulders. That's a logical thing. Or obviously focus on how you're training your shoulders. Are you spending enough time under tension with the eccentric reps? Are you rushing through your workouts, etc., etc.? So this is where we need to start to get down to the fine lines of growing muscle, growing significant amount of muscle, and obviously looking at your physique. Certainly from an outsider's perspective, so sometimes it really is beneficial to get a coach in that instance where they can look at you without bias. So the next point I will move on to is allowing for recovery time between sessions. So big mistake I see is that people are just training 7 days a week. They're not having any gaps in between, or they're doing double sessions a day. That's just ridiculous. Like, they're just overtraining. When you look at from an athletic level perspective, if you are not matching the calories with the way that you're training, you're going to find yourself sinking pretty quickly with energy availability, in that your body just does not want to push that much energy out and not take enough in, okay? And by the same token, you're looking at things like your central nervous system, your sympathetic nervous system, which are going to start to act up over time if you continue to overstimulate things like your joints and your ligaments, and the like, and like nerve endings as well. So we're not robotic. You can't just keep smashing yourself every single day and not prioritizing recovery. Recovery looks like things like taking days off, 1 to 2 rest days a week. Maybe even if you're only doing a 3 to 4 training day split, maybe you're having a few more days off, and that's completely fine. But obviously splitting them up between your sessions is ideal, because, maybe taking a Wednesday and a Sunday off or something like that, so that you've got adequate recovery time between those big sessions, and also alternating your sessions. So for example, not training shoulders Monday and Tuesday, I mean, you can try to if you really want to, but you're going to be pretty fatigued on the Tuesday. So this is where obviously in programming we look at alternating, so upper, lower, etc., etc. And obviously for the men, just looking at, if you are going to put upper body days next to each other, probably don't do an upper body day that's, if you're going to do one that's really taxing, you can probably do a slightly less taxing upper body session the next day. Vice versa, you can obviously switch it around, but if you're trying to do 2 massive upper body sessions in a row, you're going to be pretty disappointed with the fact that your body doesn't always have a 24-hour recovery period. It's not that simple. You'll actually find there's a delay with legs. Full recovery from leg training generally takes, weirdly, between 5 and 6 days. Obviously, there are some people who are training legs more often than that, but the full recovery period is actually a lot longer for legs because they're a bigger muscle group. So, in that recovery, things like stretch and release work, massages and physio, if you're finding that you're getting injuries and you're like, I want to grow, but my back is killing me and my knees are killing me, please stop ignoring it. Please go to a physio. Please go to somebody who's qualified who will help out with this. One of the downsides of working online is that I don't get to see people in person as much, so it's very difficult to assess their movement patterns, and obviously not a lot of people want to film themselves. So this is where I outsource physio sessions to anybody that I trust, obviously in the industry, that has been recommended in particular areas for different clients across Australia and across the world. But this is whereby you probably need to go in, it's not going to be an ongoing thing, but you go in for a couple of sessions, have a little bit of a look at the niggle, and that they can obviously assess your movement patterns, and then they can figure out, okay, here's what we need to maybe adjust the movement pattern, or maybe we need some release work, maybe we need some more stretches in there, maybe you need to get some more remedial massage, sports massage specifically. So in that, I want to talk about the fact that hypertrophy and bodybuilding, or building a booty, because bodybuilding, it's funny, people separate building a booty and building bodybuilding. It's exactly the same thing. It's just 2 different ways of saying it. Obviously, bodybuilding is more widely known as being the entire body, whereas booty building is just the butt. It's the same process though. They're both, all the muscles in our body. Our bum is just not an exception to the rest of our body. So just women listening, if you want to build a booty, it's exactly the same as dudes saying, I want to build a chest. So legs, shoulders, whatever you're building, your back, it's boring and repetitive, right? So look, when people they come to me and they're like, oh, I want to build muscle, can I get a change in my training plan every single week? No, you can't. You need repetition. There's a reason why you perform the same exercises. You'll have variety across your days and your weeks, but so you'll have variety from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or the 6-day, 5-day, 4-day program that you've got. And in the day, you probably won't, if a good coach will probably not have you repeating a lot of exactly the same exercises throughout the week. Maybe they will. But in that, you've got to understand that if you don't perform that same weekly structure again and again and again each week, you can't actually incur what's called progressive overload. And progressive overload is basically how we achieve hypertrophy, in that we actually progressively overload the muscle. So it's not just progressively overloading in your reps, where you're obviously increasing the reps as each individual rep is made, but obviously with your sets as well, there's progressive overload. So you're progressively exhausting and fatiguing the muscle, but then you've got progressive overload that happens across weeks. So you've got the idea that when you start a block, you might start 1 till the 12 weeks, or maybe some coaches might do 4-week blocks, whatever they prefer. But that repetition of those particular exercises in the order that you do them in for the sets and reps is a way of overloading the muscle. So it's basically just kind of like hammering it over and over and over and over again. And that repetitious process, that progressive overload over time, over long period of time, is how you achieve optimal hypertrophy from your training perspective. There is no changing this. If you changed exercise, if you changed it from 1 week to the next, how are you meant to exercise? You've just changed the piece of equipment, or you've changed from, let's say, for example, you've changed from dumbbell deadlifts to a barbell deadlift. Yes, very similar exercise, but how are you meant to progress upwards from your previous lift or your previous reps for the week? You can't, because you're changing the exercise, so there's no room for progression, right? So this is why overload progression and progressively overloading in that progression. So hopefully that kind of clears up the idea that constantly changing exercises is not actually going to benefit your goals. And any good bodybuilder will actually tell you this, that hold on, man, doing this program for quite some time, or I rotate through different 4-week blocks or whatever it might be, and that's how I train. I know myself, I literally followed a 26-week program once. I was just, it was working. There was no need to change it. A couple of obviously changes to things like reps here and there when I wanted to increase them, but really there wasn't any sort of major changes to exercise types. And even to this day, I use a very similar structure to achieve my current physique. And obviously I'm a national champion and pro figure competitor, natural athlete. So and I'm a coach myself in comp prep, so really we know that it works, and it is boring, it's necessary. So you don't get to do lots of fun exercises if your major goal is muscle growth. Like you don't get to do box jumps and burpees and skipping and like every single day. Like this type of training is really congruent with endurance training, cardio-based training, etc., but obviously lifestyle and enjoyment. You do see there are going to be people out there have a six-pack and they've got these, they're crazy shredded and ripped and whatever, and they do sprints or they might do the assault bike, etc. If you look at them though, like how frequently they're doing these sessions in correlation to how much muscle mass they have, if you're wanting to grow a significant amount of muscle mass, engaging in this type of exercise is probably not going to see that happen. You need to align your goals for what you're trying to achieve, muscle growth, with your style of training. If you want to grow a booty, right, doing burpees and trying to do muscle ups is not going to grow your ass. That's just they don't go hand in hand. You've got to match like with like, so training with your goal to make sure that happens, and not necessarily get distracted by fun exercises. Don't get me wrong, if you want to train for lifestyle, please go ahead. But just know that it can conflict with the aesthetic goals you may have for yourself, and you may end up with a body that you don't want. So along with that, the next point is, obviously there's a big debate about whether or not you need to do cardio when you're growing muscle. Look, I would honestly just suggest less cardio. In fact, reduce purposeful cardio, but keep steps in for heart health. Obviously just walks, moderate, low heart rate for walks. And obviously your well-being to buffer any sort of excess body fat, as I mentioned earlier, and gain body fat gain potentially from the surplus. So in this, there are people out there, they're superhumans who do Ironmans and they do powerlifting comps and whatever, and they cross over into different sports. There are people out there who really enjoy doing assault bike sprints, but they also really enjoy their weights training. And look, don't get me wrong, that's completely fine. But again, you've got to look at them and say, is this their lifestyle? Is this what they do for their health and wellness? Does this person have a goal to grow significant muscle? No? Okay, cool. Then maybe what they're doing isn't necessarily a representation of what's required to achieve the muscle growth goal that I have. So I say less cardio because I'm not going to say that cardio is the devil. You can incorporate small cardio here and there to buffer fat gain. But it's a double-edged sword. You don't want to put a detriment the muscle growth you're trying to achieve. So again, I think the safest thing is honestly just low intensity. So LASS, walking and increasing your steps here and there where you can to increase your activity levels that is not going to tax the energy systems which require carbohydrates in larger amounts. And obviously you want to use those carbs for your weight training for the muscle growth, not necessarily for your cardio. For this goal specifically, if you were training for an Ironman and you needed to run, if you were training for a marathon, obviously I would be giving very different advice. But this is my niche. Muscle growth and bodybuilding is my niche, so please understand that. I don't ever come from a position of favoritism. I understand that there is a respect for athletes in every single field. I've got clients who do play volleyball, who are, who are doing an Ironman competition. I've got police force and fire brigade training clients, and they all actually do consume a significant amount of carbohydrates, but also obviously engage in cardio-based activities, but they don't have muscle gain goals. And we know that because obviously the type of training that they're doing at the time can look at possibly maintaining their muscle mass if they're eating enough food, but not necessarily growing crazy amounts of muscle mass towards that type of goal. So with training, as I mentioned, more is not always more. So if you're trying to, smashing yourself in a 3-hour session every single day is not necessarily going to achieve what you want to achieve. Being effective and efficient really just comes down to looking at the idea that you don't have to do double, triple sessions. You don't have to do 7 days a week. In fact, people go, I know I don't have to, but I like to. Be very careful in the preference of what you enjoy and like and what you are driven to do because you feel anxious if you don't go to the gym, and what's optimal for muscle growth and recovery. And we must rest for muscle growth. On that note, 7 to 8 hours sleep, 7 for men, 8 for women. When we sleep, HGH, human growth hormone, is released at its best, and it's actually where we repair muscle. So it's where we repair most of our muscle is while we're sleeping. So if we aren't resting properly, if we're not recovering properly, etc., you will have disrupted sleep. You're going to have lots of issues with actually repairing the muscle, and you're basically just going around on the wheel and not really going anywhere. So just keep in mind that more is not always more. Be consistent with the 4, 5, 6 day training program you have. Don't feel like you have to go in for a 3-hour session, and be patient with the idea that the session that you're doing is going to be enough, especially if it's been programmed for you. So the next, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Okay, this is probably one of the more important ones. You're going to gain body fat when you're trying to gain a significant amount of muscle mass. It's just going to happen. You can't avoid it. Okay, everyone just tries to avoid, can I take this supplement? Can I do this? No, you're going to gain some amount of body fat. That's what happens in a surplus. You can't just make it all muscle. That's not how it works. We can't just program our bodies like that. So in that though, obviously it's kind of like embracing that part of your life. So it's kind of like, okay, cool, I'm thicker than usual. Awesome. I will get some clothes that fit me while I'm in this period of time. I actually have a wardrobe which ranges from, say, women's size 6 to women's size 10 to 12. And I just know that, okay, I'm going to be wearing my 10 to 12 at the moment because I'm broader, and my bum's a little bit bigger, my legs are a bit thicker, and my waist isn't as small as it was when I was cutting. But this is all very beneficial for my goals. So really it's just clothes. What is stopping you from having a wardrobe that's diverse? And then when I go through my cuts, I've still got sizes in there that are 6 to 8. They're going to be pieces I can wear across different seasons. And this is the smartest way to get through growth and growth stages and cut stages, but also general life. Like, we can't just constantly maintain where we are, and we can't glorify the idea of doing that either. It can create a lot of anxiety for people to feel like they have to be in a size 8 or 10 forever. You can go down and up depending on your goals. And if you adjust your wardrobe, it actually will give you a sense of relief, because there's going to be some pieces that actually look better on you when you're slightly curvier or thicker, and there's going to be pieces that look better on you when you are maybe slimmer, and that's okay. You don't have to glorify this idea that clothes only look good when you're slim. So And obviously there are some things that look terrible when you're really lean as well, that just hang off you and, you know, it looks like you're wearing a potato sack. So just keep in mind that the life of being lean is not always wonderful for wearing clothing. Trust me, I've been there a few times and it's actually quite difficult to find things that fit properly. So on the next point, reduce alcohol intake around training times to preserve muscle mass. I mean, generally reducing alcohol intake in general is going to help out with muscle growth. If you look at the concept of, you know, alcohol being if you look into how alcohol is processed in the body, if you're doing a heavy training session and you're drinking like later on in the day and you're eating protein, your body actually doesn't absorb the protein from the meal. It prefers to absorb the alcohol first. And if you're eating in a calorie surplus, it's more likely to store the protein as body fat. So it's where we start to kind of risk the idea of, I'm not trying to put the fear of or anything like that. It's just that you're going to risk muscle growth through large amounts or excessive amounts of alcohol consumption. You will see muscle wastage probably be more prevalent with alcohol consumption. So limiting or reducing alcohol consumption for muscle growth goals. I mean, if you are going to try and consume alcohol, maybe try and do it on a rest day. But even then, you know, you do have that whole concept of alcohol being processed in the body as energy before protein is. So it can be a little bit of a sticky situation with making sure that you're not, you know, you're not kind of sabotaging your goals with your alcohol consumption. So it could be one of the only things you need to change. And obviously if the moment you're not eating enough actual calories and you're drinking a ton of alcohol, and let's say you're trying to grow muscle, so you're not eating enough protein, etc., but maybe you're over consuming alcohol and you've gained a bit of body fat, etc., maybe because you're in a calorie surplus, you're going to see that things will significantly change when you actually start to eat your calories instead of drinking them, because their protein and carbs and fats that are consumed in the body are actually used for specific purposes. As I said, energy provision, muscle growth, and obviously hormone balance and absorbing different vitamins and minerals and digestion. Alcohol is used for literally none of those except energy provision. And the energy provision only really works very temporarily because it's very quickly absorbed, but we do see that alcohol is a depressant. So the following day after consuming a large amount of alcohol, you will see a mood dip. So I'm not a hater on alcohol, but I certainly think that some people could afford to reduce or, you know, cut down alcohol a little bit if they do have some big goals in their health and life. So the next point is obviously don't train fasted. Please stop training fasted. I've said this so many times in podcasts. I don't know how many times I need to say this. Please stop training fasted, especially if you're trying to grow muscle. Your performance will be inhibited if you're not eating enough carbohydrates, if you're spending time in those moderate to high heart rate training zones, especially for weights training. Fasted weights training sessions never went well unless they were super low heart rate sessions, because they can. You can do a fasted low heart rate session. Probably the only thing I would really say would be conducive to that would be something like darts or snooker or lawn bowls. Like really, other than that, if you're looking at growing muscle, training fasted literally makes no sense. So make sure you have carbs prior to training, whether it's even something small in the morning, but just something to get you going. The recommendation is 40 to 60 grams prior to training, but this can differ from individual to individual depending on lots and lots of different factors like height, weight, etc. But that's the recommended range, which is pretty easy to follow. So the next point is the people you see on the internet have been doing this for years. They may be using enhancement substances, dangerous and illegal, illicit substances like PEDs and fat burners, or they may do this as a career. So obviously don't be deceived by someone's highlight reel. You might see me and go, oh my God, she's amazing. 10 years of training, dude. 10 years of consistent training, you know, between 4 and 6 days a week. I really don't take any time off unless I'm sick. So just an FYI, the people you currently see have been doing this for a long time. If you're looking at their bodies and going, oh, goal body, look at their training history, look how long they've been training for. Even the ones who are enhanced, they're still having to train for 3 to 4 years, you know, plus to be able to achieve those types of body types, okay? So the next point, I'm going to talk a little bit about supplements. Oh, and on the previous note as well, it takes time for literally everyone to grow, and to get mature and dense muscle. Sure, you can grow some muscle in a couple of years, but to make that dense and mature and actually start to come out from the body and actually have some depth to it, it's going to take time. It just takes time, lots of time, consistency, repetition. It's exactly the same as a deficit, but much longer, much, much, much longer. So obviously on the topic of supplements, they're not a cure-all and actually have very small influence on the bigger picture. So big mistake I see is that people kind of go out and buy all the supplements in the world when they're trying to bulk. They buy a mass gainer and they buy this and they buy that. They are a supplement, meaning they supplement the thing that's probably better to consume in its rawest form. So now, obviously, things like WPO powder, etc., is fantastic for those who don't want to eat meat every single meal of the day. For God's sake, I don't want to do that. So it's great to add to things like your breakfast, to your pour it, put it in a protein shake, pour it over your cereal, put it in yogurt. You might even put it in your oats. You can have it as a protein shake by itself, but there's protein bars that have protein powder in them as well. But just fantastic for getting to your protein intake. So it's something that helps you reach your actual total protein intake without having to eat meat 6 times a day or 5 times or 4 times a day. So obviously, but supplements are not a cure-all. Like as I mentioned, you can't just take all these crazy supplements and then pop up with crazy muscles tomorrow. That's just not how supplements work. Less of them work than the ones that actually do. And a lot of them are going to be a supplementation for the thing that, that you're trying to achieve. So you're not necessarily taking a magic pill or you're not taking a magic shake. It's not like this weird, crazy process occurs. It's something that serves a purpose that is already in things that we consume in our diet, should be, and if you're getting enough variety in your diet, you should see that you will get that at optimal levels. So on the note of supplements, yes, creatine can be used, but must be loaded correctly. There is recommendations for the loading periods. Talk to your coach about that. I'm not going to go into it again, but there's a loading period of the first week, and then after that, you need to continue taking it every day or it's completely fucking pointless. So creatine is a really hard one. You need to make sure you are consistent with it for it to start working. You'll see some weight, which is mostly due to the fact that the water needs to hold the creatine on the muscles. There's no sort of like weird side effects with fat gain, so just an FYI. Creatine will cause some sort of newbie gains in that you will see a spike up in weight within the first few days. So, however, we get creatine from our diet. If we're getting an array of different protein sources, it contains creatine. Okay, it's not like some sort of magical weird powdered sub. I don't take creatine. I've never really had. I'm too inconsistent with some things, like taking my vitamins and minerals and stuff. If I do take them, because I obviously have a great diet as it is. So if I want to take additional magnesium, etc., I can sometimes miss those. So I find that creatine would just be one that I would get really frustrated with if I did take it, and I don't see the risk versus reward for me isn't great because I probably will forget to take it. So I only suggest taking creatine for someone who's really struggling to gain muscle but is already doing all of the above that I've suggested. So if you're that type of body, that body type where you're quite slim, yes, creatine may help you a little bit if you are very consistent with it and you load it correctly and continue to take it. So caffeine can aid performance in the gym if you like consuming it. So that's just another thing to add on top, is just if that's in the supplement realm, caffeine is probably and is the only one that we can get behind that aids performance on a larger scale. Things like beta-alanine has some science to support it. And there's also things like you can consume bicarbonate soda to help out with lactic acid buildup. So there's a couple of little things here and there, but really it's much less than you would think and assume. So protein powder, as I mentioned, is a supplement for meat, egg white, dairy-based protein sources, etc. So like yogurts. So use it as a supplement to hit your protein goal, not as the magic tool to grow muscle and have protein shakes every damn meal. Please stop being that guy. Unless you don't like having protein any other way. And honestly, if you are having protein shakes every few hours and you're also eating meat, you may be over consuming your protein and it may be pointless. You may need some more carbs in there. So this is where you can't just wing it. You've actually got to start to think about what's going into your diet. So the final point is taking deload weeks. Stepping back can help us step forward. So if you are finding that you're injury prone, that you're just riddled with injuries and you're having a bad time, also things like hormone changes, big stressful periods of time in your life, etc., travel, blah, blah, blah. It is appropriate to take deload weeks. How often that is, it really differs from person to person, depending on your adaptation points and depending on your body's tolerance levels to exercise, etc. But really, you're looking at when you feel like shit, when you feel trashed and every one of your sessions is just awful, like you're just starting to really slide down there. You're eating plenty of food, you're getting plenty of rest, you've got plenty of electrolytes on board as well. Like you're ticking all the boxes, you're drinking enough water. That's another note, drink enough water daily to help out with muscle building because it will help out with performance. But honestly, if you are really struggling, if you're on struggle street, you really need to think about the idea that taking deload weeks isn't necessarily being weak. It's actually giving you an opportunity to grow and to move forward. So you can take deload weeks literally as regular as every 6 to 8 weeks, every 12 weeks, even if every 6 months if you really love exercising that intensively. But again, it can really help. Okay, pretty much it from me. I'm going to finish up the podcast right on an hour. Thank you so much for listening, tuning in. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share our podcast and vlog. It helps us with exposure and obviously what we're trying to achieve, spreading the word of getting those gains out to the world. Looking forward to doing another podcast for you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.